And this is from a different section of your book, but I would also like for you to kind of address this idea of why capitalism isn't the problem. It's something much deeper than that. So all of those ideas, lay it on us. Give us kind of your broad brush overview of these global NGO organizations and how they control finance.
So first off, I would say Alex Gladstein has just been immensely influential in this. And so I don't want to take any credit for this chapter, because I think that I've very much used a lot of the information comes from Alex. And so for a more in-depth kind of breakdown of this, I'm sure you probably spoke to Alex on the show, and there's countless interviews with Alex. So I highly recommend digging into some of Alex's work, because it will go far deeper than I go. But I wanted to more just highlight that we have institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the Bank of International Settlements. And many of these institutions are completely unelected. We don't have a democracy in whereby we're voting these people in power and we have an understanding about what they're doing. Many times, like the Bank of International Settlements, which is arguably it's named kind of the central bank of central banks, they're kind of governing a lot of the roles the central banks are making, and they're completely in secret. We don't know many times what it is that they're doing because it's completely behind closed doors. And so we have this kind of elite of elite that have major influence over the world and a lot of these policies, and we have zero understanding about what they're doing. And let's just dive into more, because obviously I'm conscious of time, but let's just dive into a little bit about kind of like the IMF and the World Bank. And so when you look at the IMF, their whole policy is supposedly trying to help minimize poverty globally and help support a lot of the developing countries. And I would argue, and I'm sure Alex would as well, that this is 100% almost the opposite. And so first and foremost, when you lend, if you want to support a developing country by lending them money, think about what lending money means. Well, a loan involves both principal and interest payments. So at some point, the loan is going to be paying back more than the initial money lent. And so when a lot of these big nations and a lot of these kind of unelected organizations lend money to developing countries, that developing country eventually is going to be paying back more. So it's actually pulling money out of the country. And so since the 1970s, if I quote it correctly, for every $1 that has been fed into developing countries, we've seen $24 in outflows. And so this is why these developing countries are on their knees, because they're just being absolutely decimated by these huge debt burdens. Yeah. And so what usually happens is the IMF will come into these countries and will say, hey, we see you're struggling. We want to support you. We think you've got phenomenal natural resources. You've got phenomenal productive capacity, and we want to help you realize that potential. So we're going to lend you X amount of money. But the reality is, what ends up happening is, one, they usually overestimate the productive capacity or the resources which they've got. And that is usually intentionally, because what that means is that this country is no longer able to meet their debt service payments. And when that country no longer meets their debt service payments, the IMF, or the country that is in support through the IMF, then steps in and says, okay, we realize you're not able to meet your debt service payments. How about you give us control over your resources? How about you give us political control? How about you allow us to put a military base in your country? And so this is what we're starting to see, is although we have however many nations globally, 200 something nations globally, most of them are under the thumb of the US or China through the Belt and Road Initiative, or Russia. And a lot of this has been, the IMF has very much facilitated a lot of this for the US. And so a lot of these nations, they no longer have autonomy. They no longer have autonomy because they've supposedly had the IMF help them out and supposedly had the IMF try and support them in a way that reduces their poverty. But it's done the complete opposite. And this is where, as well, when these unelected organizations step in to try and support these countries, what it does is, if you have a very authoritarian controlling structure in place, naturally, the IMF actually ends up supporting those structures. In a free market system, if you've got a controlling structure in place and it no longer offers value to the society and it starts to break down, the country would default. And as the country defaults, you then have another party rise up that is able to offer value. And so you actually allow creative destruction to take place. The IMF actually perpetuates these controlling structures by enabling these people that are not offering or not doing what is best for their populace. Instead, many times they're just trying to facilitate what benefits them and benefits their pockets. And so I tend to be of the opinion that a lot of these unelected organizations, we're seeing that same misalignment to reality. We're seeing that same breakdown of creative destruction, distortion of capital flows. We're seeing that same process play out on a global level as well as a nation state level. And I tend to be massively against it, because I think when you start to intervene, byproducts start happening. You impede the free market from kind of naturally allowing capital to flow to where it's needed.
So Seb, each year, I at the end of the year, I try to think of the best book or the best couple books that I've read throughout the year, and I try to read 40 books a year is kind of what I try to shoot for. Sometimes I miss the mark, but this year, Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, was up there, and what she did with her book is she covers the evolution of how the technology has inserted itself with money, And she covers this in just in a way that only Lynn can cover a topic, right? And she talks about kind of Bitcoin being a solution to many of the problems that broken money has caused throughout time immemorial. This book, I put on par with Lynn's book this year, The Hidden Cost of Money. And I say that because for you were much more granular in like right now, what people are dealing with. And you do it in such a thoughtful, organized, just robust manner that gets straight to the point, and there's not all this fluff. I mean, the points that you're making, as people can see in this interview, I mean, my gosh, man, you like crushed this interview. The book is just like this, but in so much more detail for people to dig into. So like, I just want to put it on par with Lynn's book this year. For people listening, like, you have to go out there and you have to read this book. It is so phenomenal.
I was just going to say one more thing quickly that I think is really important on the health front. And this is, again, like, when we talk about Bitcoin, when we talk about the financial world, we tend to look at it purely just from the financial perspective. And I think that one of the ones, like, I've been fascinated by psychology and I've been fascinated by parenting for kind of 10 years. I've read a lot about psychology and parenting, and I'm kind of partway through becoming a therapist. And one of the things it talks about, one of the things that I found really interesting is talking about the link between money and parenting. And naturally, this is where I think it's fascinating, is money is the number one cause of stress in the world. There's something like 74% of Americans have major significant financial stresses. And it's also the second leading cause of divorce behind kind of adultery. And so when we start thinking that money is the number one cause of stress, well, how does that impact children? Well, first off, when a mum is kind of giving birth to a child, when that child is inside of her, naturally, if she is feeling immense stress, she's going to feel stress hormones, a lot of stress hormones, cortisol and whatnot. And those stress hormones acutely affect the child. And that child, when that child is in its prime developmental period, is naturally going to be born with a hyperactive threat response system. And when I say threat response system, I mean like fight, flight, and freeze and whatnot. And when we talk about a threat response system, those are to do something that's very important, to escape threatening situations. But if our threat response system is engaged all the time, when we have our threat response system engaged, it impairs our nutrient flow, it impairs our breathing, it impairs blood flow, it leads to a whole host of other issues. And so I would argue that given money is the number one stressor globally, and we are seeing rising rates of ADD, we're seeing rising rates of depression, we're seeing rising rates of suicide, we're seeing rising rates of autism, we're seeing, you name it, anything. Like, we are just seeing rising rates of health issues left, right, and center. And people's immune systems are just shot. And I would say that our monetary system has a part to play in that, because it is the number one stressor and it is acutely impacting our developmental years. And then not only that, but when you look at, say, parents, when parents have less time to spend with their children because they're having to work more. And a perfect example of this is in 1970, just before the kind of the transition off the gold standard, we used to have twice the amount of single earner households to dual earner households. So that means you've got one parent working versus two. Now it's a complete reverse, where we have twice the amount of dual earner households to single earner households. And that's because parents cannot get by without both having to work. You can't afford a house without both having to work. And that's, let alone, most people probably can't afford a house. And so naturally, parents are spending less time with their kids. And so if parents are spending less time with their kids, they are that moral compass that helps that kid find its individuality. And so instead, kids are looking to their peers. And when kids look to their peers, well, peer relationships, especially early on, are very superficial. They're trying to simply look the same, sound the same, feel the same, dress the same, and whatnot. And so we end up with this society of sheep, and they have not individuated. And this is where I think when you look back at more traditional societies, communities, elders play such an important role. Parents play such an important role in helping kids develop their moral standpoint, their compass in life. And so you can see this in society where kids are not being raised by elders. Kids are not being raised by their parents. They're being raised by their peers, and it's leading to a whole host of other issues. And so again, this stems, I would argue, this is a large in part because of our monetary system, creating a whole host of stress and impeding parents' ability to direct their time where they'd like to direct their time. Sorry, I rambled there a little bit.
No, oh my God, those are